Welcome all. Thank you for joining today's AWRI webinar. My name's Jeff Cowie and I'm a Senior Enologist at the AWRI. In the spirit of reconciliation, the AWRI acknowledges the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to the land, the sea and the community. We pay our respects to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples today. In today's webinar, we will look at an overview of the 2021 National Vintage Report. But before we make a start, a couple of notes. Due to the current lockdown in South Australia, the AWRI premises, including the commercial services, will be closed to at least next Tuesday, with staff working from home. So for technical support or sustainability questions, you can continue to contact the AWRI help desk at helpdesk@awri.com.au, the commercial lab, commercial services at awri.com.au, and other email addresses are now on the homepage of the AWRI website. A couple of quick reminders for anyone that's new to AWRI webinars. If you would like to provide a comment or ask a question, click on the Q&A button on the Zoom toolbar, type your question and press send to send it through. So we'll hold a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, but with this one as well, possibly with halfway through as well. But ask your questions at any time, send them through and we'll address them then. A reminder that this session is being recorded, and you'll be emailed a link to view this recording at the end of the session, and these recordings will be on the AWRI YouTube channel. For anyone who's just joined, welcome. Today's AWRI webinar is called An Overview of the 2021 National Vintage Report. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Sandy Hathaway. Sandy Hathaway is a Senior Analyst in the Market Insights team at Wine Australia. Sandy has particular responsibility for the National Vintage and Direct-to-Consumer surveys, the Vinsights Vineyard Mapping program and tool, which I'm sure a few of you have used before, and also Domestic Market Insights. Sandy's been involved in the Australian wine sector for more than 20 years. I'm sure many of you have come across her before, and has been working at Wine Australia since 2016. Sandy, if you're ready to make a start, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. This is where I have to share my screen. Hopefully I've got that right. Okay, so good morning, everyone, and I hope you enjoy this overview of the Vintage 2021 report. It was certainly an enjoyable vintage report to put together, unlike last year's. What I will be covering today is an overview of the crush by state and region and by colour and variety, go over prices and look at the implications of this vintage going forward. There's certainly been lots of talk about that. There's a full national report on our website, and there's also our exciting new dashboards, which I'm going to talk about a bit today and just demonstrate to you how you can access all this information yourself online from now on. Okay, so 2021, we've called it the Unicorn Vintage. A unicorn event is an event so rare, unique or unlikely that you know it will never happen again. An unusual way perhaps to describe a vintage, but I'll go through why we've called it that. So just the high level statistics, it was 2.03 million tonnes. It was actually 2,028,248 tonnes, which I think is a lovely, satisfying, even number. That was up 31% compared with last year. The value, meanwhile, was up 36% compared with last year, or $400 million more in weighbridge value. And that was because there was a slight increase in the average purchase price as well as the increase in volume. So this crush was really the perfect contrast with 2020. And this is why we think of it as a unicorn vintage, because everything came together with, widespread ideal growing and ripening conditions. It was the coolest summer in 10 years after last summer was the second hottest. December 2020 was the third wettest, whereas December 2019 was the driest. but we didn't get any rain at the wrong time. And we got long, cool autumn days, so ripening was slow. It was easy to get wine into the wineries. There was less disease pressure. And I realise I'm generalising across a very big country. It may not have been true for everybody's situation, but it was certainly widespread across the regions. So that's given us high quality and quantity. The yield, although it was a record, is not really that different to 2017, but with the overall production, but we think that the yield was perhaps slightly lower because the area was a little bit higher then. So where did the crush come from? Well, 52% of the crush came from South Australia, which was more than its share's been before, at least since we've been collecting it in 2015. Last year it was only 49%. New South Wales had 29%. Because it was up by less than South Australia and also less than Victoria. It actually lost share of the overall crush, but it was still very high. And the largest individual region was the Riverland, which had a record crush of over 550,000 tonnes. And it's worth noting that if you take out the river regions, so Murray-Darling, Swan Hill and Riverina, the New South Wales has a 2% share of the national crush and Victoria has a 5% share. And again, just going around the regions a little bit, most regions increased by more than 30% compared with last year. Some of it was just like particularly heartening when you saw the devastation from the previous year due to bushfires. So we had crush again for the first time from Tumbarumba and Canberra district. They may have had a small crush last year, but none was reported to us. The Adelaide Hills was up 150%. Rattenbully and the Riverland had record crushes. And in the case of South Australia, we've got records going back to 1996. So that's a very long time for it to be hitting a record now. And then some other regions that you can see there, they're smaller regions with smaller tonnages, but over 200% increases. And in fact, the 5 largest regions outside of the river regions are all in South Australia, and they're the Barossa, Langhorne Creek, Coonawarra, Pathway and McLaren Vale in that order. And 3 of them more than doubled their crush in 2021. Looking at variety, or first by colour, as you can see, like the red crush was the largest for at least 15 years. It was over 1 million tonnes. It was 31% above the 10-year average, and I think 37% above last year. So it was the one that drove all the increase. The white crush was up too, but in fact lost share to reds. So reds is now up to 57%, which is the highest it's been since 2004. And you can see from that chart there, the orange bars are the white, and they're just basically slowly going down from a peak in 2011 where reds were 45 and whites were 55, and it's now pretty well reversed. And this is being driven obviously by the difference in price paid for reds compared with whites because of demand. And of course the reds are almost all Shiraz. I mean, if you look at those bars there, you can see the orange bar is this year's crush of Shiraz. It was 41% up on last year, and it dominates those varieties, and they are the top 10. So if you think you go from number 1 Shiraz down to even Pinot Noir, and you're at less than 10% of the red crush. So Shiraz is driving most of the increase, and it's contributing now 27% of the total crush and 46% of all reds. In the smaller varieties, and still in the top 10, your Mataro or Mourvedre, if you prefer, and Malbec, they had the largest increases in percentage terms, while Durif continued to grow. It's been jumping up the ranks of the top 10 for a couple of years now, and Ruby Cabernet is conversely dropping back. And then looking at the whites, again, you can see the dominance of Chardonnay, possibly even more so compared with other whites. With, you know, Sauvignon Blanc has little more than a quarter of the crush of Chardonnay, and it's our second largest white variety. Chardonnay was up 33%, but as you saw, Shiraz was up by more than that. So Chardonnay actually lost share to Shiraz. And that's true of all the white varieties, really. Looking at the top 10, they all grew except Gewürztraminer, which has been declining for a while now. And Prosecco is, although again still looking quite small in the scheme of things, it saw its biggest increase, with its crush more than double its 5-year average, and I think more than double that compared with last year. Now this is just another way you can look at varieties. What I've done here is, if you took every variety's crush in 2016 and you just called that 1 basically, and then you compare its crush in each subsequent year back to 2016, what that enables you to do is compare them directly without worrying about their absolute tonnes. And even percentage increases don't always help you, because you can have an increase that's a fairly small amount, but it's a bigger percent of a smaller variety. So how do you compare? But with this one, you can look at all those varieties, and basically, if they stay at 1 from 2016 to 2021, then the crush hasn't changed apart from seasonal variations. So you can see there that most of the whites are sitting slightly below the 1. And the two big increases are in Gruner Veltliner and Prosecco, which are now like more than 4 times their crush in 2016. And 2016 was a similar crush to 2021, but a bit lower. So, you know, even if a crush stayed the same, you'd expect it to be slightly above 1. And here you can see that, in fact, all the varieties except the top 5 have declined in that time period. Gordeaux's about the same, and then the top 5 above that are the only ones that have increased. And Chardonnay, as if you like a reference variety because it's the largest, that one's declined by 7% over that time. And then correspondingly looking at the reds, and I've deliberately used the same scale here. So the first thing you might notice is that there's no red that's increased by nearly as much as those 2 big moving whites. But on the other hand, almost all of the reds have increased in the last 5 years, with only Tempranillo and Cabernet Franc declining. And Shiraz has increased by 22%. And so now I'd like to be very adventurous and try and switch to the dashboard so I can show you how you can look at this information on the dashboards. All right, hoping you can all see this friendly face here on our Wine Australia homepage. So when you're looking at the homepage, if you come across to Market Insights and then slide across to Interactive Insights, it will open this, what we're calling a portal. And there's a few dashboards on here. Some of you might be interested in the export dashboard, but the vintage survey one's the one I'm going to look at now, but I'm just going to switch to it because I've already got it open. And the other thing I'm going to do is refresh the screen because I've left it open for a while, so it does tend to need refreshing. So this is our new dashboard, and this overview page will show you the estimated crush. There's my happy even number. As I said to you about South Australia having a share of 50%, I can choose South Australia, 52% share, crush and average value over time, and a bit more information there as well. And the other thing, and then if we go back to say 2016, see what the share was then, almost the same. And then on the variety intake table, I mentioned Prosecco before. If I have a look for Prosecco here, you can see this is the crush of Prosecco by region and the average value paid where there are enough tonnes purchased for us to report it. So there's more own grown than purchased Prosecco, but you can see the total tonnage there, 14,000 tonnes. If I compare that with 2015, 1,952. So that's the huge increase we've seen in Prosecco over that time. I'm going to switch back to the presentation now. Was there anything, Jeff, that anyone wanted to raise before I move on?
There's no questions that have come through, but I suppose I had one that you made me think of, just looking at that, the tables there. With the Prosecco example that is looking at a 50% or 53% increase from last year, and obviously you can go back a few years as well. Do you think that increase is just because of more plantings over the last few years coming to fruition? Like, can you compare that with the vineyard scan in terms of how many plantings of Prosecco there might be versus the tonnage estimated?
We don't have up-to-date information on plantings by variety, unfortunately. We haven't had since the ABS stopped doing its survey in 2015. So we can't directly relate it. But all we can say is that crush in general is related to plantings. So if Prosecco is increasing by as much as that, then it must be driven by new plantings, because there's only so much you can do with a yield increase, I guess, and preferential water allocation. So Prosecco definitely would be an example of new plantings going in, but we can't quantify that, unfortunately, because we don't have up-to-date planting data by variety.
Okay, yeah, thanks. That's good to know. It's hard comparing to last year, I think, because of whether people were in drought or bushfires or all the other things that happened last year. So, but it's good that you can compare or toggle back the different vintages on that tool. So that's very good.
Yeah, well, and of course that's right, because when we looked at Prosecco last year, it had grown, and yet we know that some of the regions that have the most Prosecco were affected by fire and or smoke. So we knew that the underlying growth would have been a lot higher if it hadn't been for those things. But it does make it very difficult to compare year on year when you've got seasonal factors compounded with changes in growing or, changes in planting areas. So yeah, it's a bit tricky. And yeah, the more data you can look at, I guess, the better. And I like this sort of long-term view that we've tried to take here, where you can see from this line just how much it's increased, which is far too much to be a yield increase on the same vineyards. Yeah.
So a couple of comments from the audience as well, saying, yeah, Prosecco growth is certainly new planting driven. And then there was another comment from another attendee, just really saying it's interesting to see the 22% increase in Shiraz, and even more interesting to see the figure over the next two vintages coming. So that was more just a comment.
Yes, and I do obviously want to look at the outlook and what's ahead. Now, I think with Shiraz, with an established variety like Shiraz, and in the bigger irrigated regions or anywhere maybe where water has been expensive or is sometimes more expensive than at other times, growers may be making a choice to water their Shiraz more than their Chardonnay, for example. And I think that's probably been happening over time. And that, may change now as demand changes. But we don't know, I guess, how much is also new plantings going in and how much is yet to come. Although in South Australia, you can see that, because we do have in the SA Crush report, there are planting tables and you can see the new plantings in each year. And I did notice this year there was quite a big drop off, whereas last year and the year before, you've seen sort of quite big chunks of Shiraz and to a lesser extent Cabernet going in. But even then, they're not much more than, say, a 1% new planting, maybe up to 4%, but you're always also going to lose some. So that doesn't mean it's a net increase. It just means that there are some refreshed plantings going in. Anyway, let's perhaps move on, shall we?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So looking at prices now, please put a comment in if you need any more background explanation or look at the report in terms of how we calculate the average value, but essentially we ask wineries to tell us what they paid for grapes at the weighbridge. So it's a weighbridge price or a farm gate price. If possible, it's a farm gate price, but sometimes it's just a delivered price. It doesn't make a lot of difference, and it's the same every year. So we can compare very reliably year on year. And what we found this year, which perhaps some people weren't expecting, was an average value increase of 1% to $701 a tonne, which is the highest it's been since 2008. But when you look at that more closely, reds actually declined by 4%. They were 871 last year, 833 this year. And then that was counterbalanced by an 11% increase in the average value of whites overall. So they were up from 486 to 538. This is the first time we've seen red prices decline since 2014, which you can see on that chart. And we see it as indicating a clear shift in demand now towards whites. The other thing, which I haven't put in the report, it's very hard to explain, so a little easier now in this context. If you think about the whole crush, and it's national and it's contributed by a number of different regions, last year the regions that suffered the least were the 3 inland river regions, which generally have the prices around $600 and below. And the other regions, you know, and some of them perhaps that have the highest average values of up around $1,500 to $2,000 a tonne, like, you know, maybe the Barossa Valley, Orange. Some of those regions had the biggest drop in tonnage. So what happens is you've got less contribution from those higher value grapes into the mix. So the average value was lower last year because of that, and it's increased now this year because of the increased contribution from the higher value regions. So even if everybody paid exactly the same for grapes this year that they paid last year, we would have seen an average value increase. So what that tells you is that very small increase is probably hiding an underlying drop in value in individual region variety combinations. And I can actually show you that. This is in South Australia, because I happen to have this chart already, and we actually have South Australian data going way back beyond this. But what you can see here is the Barossa Valley Shiraz line. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor or not, but anyway, it's the top line. And you can see that it was actually the highest it's been for 20, well, what are we, 13 years on that scale. It's actually the highest it's ever been up to last year, and then it dropped this year. McLaren Vale Shiraz dropped this year. Coonawarra Cabernet dropped this year, and Langhorne Creek Cabernet dropped this year. But on the other hand, the whites, the Riverland Chardonnay, the Clare Riesling, and the Adelaide Hills Sauvignon Blanc all increased this year. So that's a general sort of a pattern. And again, it doesn't apply everywhere. So if you have a look at this region here, you can see that the Cabernet's increased slightly and the Chardonnay has actually dropped slightly. Again, the Shiraz has increased slightly, the Sauvignon Blanc has dropped off, and Semillon's increased. So for all of you playing at home, we won't do a poll, but have a think about, or have a guess in your own mind which region you think this is. And what I'll do is take you to the dashboard again. So this time, you could find it out the hard way if you had to, but I'm going to just tell you. So the region intake tables, these some of you are used to seeing in PDF form each day. But that region that I was looking at there was Margaret River. So if I pull up the Margaret River region intake table, you can see all the stats for this. So we've got, I should look at it on this screen, shouldn't I? We've got the Cabernet, as you can see there, had that small increase. And in fact, reds overall increased by 3%. And there were very few regions where that was the case. And whites, well, Chardonnay went backwards, which again was unusual, but overall they still saw a slight increase in whites. Yep. So I will switch back again. Anything else, Jeff, that you want to throw in at the moment? I'll take that as a no.
No, I think that's
all good.
no questions yet.
All right, so price dispersion is another way you can look at what's happening with prices. So rather than just lumping everything together and saying what's the average, you can look at every single batch that gets reported to us and put it in the right price segment. So if you know, a winery paid $750 for a batch of 20 tons of something, that gets put into this basket along with anything else that was in that price range, but it's on the individual batch basis. And what you can see here is very, very clear that the pink line is the red dispersion from last year, whereas the red line is the red dispersion from this year, and it's dropped backwards quite substantially. And in terms of numbers, the share of grapes purchased at between $600 and $900 for reds has gone from 71% last year to 15% this year. And the share purchased at below $600 has gone from 15% last year to 60% this year. And again, all this information is available on the dashboard. And this is new. We've never been able to provide this before. So here we have a price dispersion tab. I can show you first just, you know, if we have all the regions and we just put in red, then we can look at the price dispersion for all the reds. You can see here the dark green lines are this year and the lighter green lines are last year. Every time you slide over something, you'll also be able to see the percentage in each bar, and the numbers at the bottom are $50 increments. So this is very detailed price reporting. So the best way to use this probably is for you to think of your own region and your own variety and have a look at that. Oops, wrong one, sorry. And then maybe look at what you got paid and how that compares to the distribution. And that can be a useful tool in negotiating prices going forward as well, because you're not just looking at one average figure. You can see how widely the prices are dispersed around that average and what share fall into each price bracket. So this is a very useful tool. And again, in this case, you can actually go all the way back to 2008. Because Wine Australia used to collect purchase data back that far, it just didn't collect everything. So with the other tables, you can only go back to 2015, but with this one, you can go all the way back to 2008. All right, so looking at the implications, there's been an awful lot of talk about this and quite strong views either way, I guess. Are we in oversupply? We obviously had a record vintage, and that can be seen as potentially causing oversupply, particularly as everyone knows what's happened with China. But let's just take a broader perspective on this. The record tonnage balanced out the two previous low-yielding vintages. If you look at the three of them together and you average them out across the three, it's only slightly above the long-term average anyway. And wineries went into 2021 with stocks at historically low levels after 3 years where sales exceeded production. And you can see that on this chart here. The pink line at the top is inventory, which is declining. And then the red line is sales, which for the last 3 years has been higher than production. This information is in our annual production, sales and inventory report, which is also on our website. The other thing to think about is that globally, Australia accounts for just 5% of wine production. And so we don't really know whether we're in oversupply until we know what everyone else is doing. We've heard that France may lose 30% of their crop this year due to frost. And 30% of their crop is about equal to all of ours. So if that was the case, the global crush has just lost the equivalent of our whole crush. On the other hand, some people are reporting that Spain is looking like having an above average vintage. And again, a 15% increase for them equals our whole crop. So we really have to wait and see the size of this year's Northern Hemisphere harvest before we know what the, just how competitive the global wine market will be. And in addition to that, we don't know yet what's going to happen with demand as countries start to come out of lockdown and more normal consumption resumes in those big drinking countries like Italy and Spain and France. We don't know what's going to happen to demand there. Are they going to be in recession? Are they going to return to the on-trade? Are they going to keep drinking wine? So we really don't know how that's going to play out. But it is certainly true that at the moment there's a higher demand for whites than reds on the international wine market, and particularly Sauvignon Blanc is in short supply, and it didn't help, it depends how you look at it, but it didn't help the global picture that New Zealand had a very small crop this year, so Sauvignon Blanc is in very short supply. So anyone out there who's got Sauvignon Blanc, that is a good position to be in. And the other point to make is that although it was a record crush, and this is only our estimate at the moment, remember, but it is only 32,000 tonnes or 1.5% higher than 2017, which I think we will handle pretty well. But the good thing about 2017 was that there was a small global harvest and China demand was just picking up. So the situation is different, which brings me to this. So continuing the mythical theme, excuse me, a colleague of mine made the point that in the old days where we thought that the earth was flat, the map drawers would put dragons at the limit of maps. So they'd say, look, we don't know, but there's something scary out there, so here be dragons was the phrase that went on the maps. And we're thinking that perhaps that's a way to think about what's ahead. We know that our volume and value of exports have declined. So this is the latest financial year. This data was only released yesterday. And you can see that our volume of exports and our value of exports have plunged since about, September last year. And there's two main reasons for this. I mean, one is lack of supply because the 2020 harvest was so small. And in fact, the two before that weren't that big. So that's been partly it. If you don't have the supply available, you can't sell it. But of course, the effect of China has now started to play out. And I do have a slide on that in a minute. Before I show you that one though, if you notice this, crush and exports line up pretty well. I mean, in Australia, there's some simple maths. We produce about 1.2 billion litres of wine a year, and about 500 million of that goes to the domestic market, which is pretty stable. So that leaves you in an average year with only 700 million litres for exporting. But when you have a bigger crop, you have more available. The export market is huge, so we're never going to say that is the ceiling on demand. But somewhere between maybe 7, 8, 900 million litres we can put out into the export market, depending on what we have available. And you can see here we've had less available, so exports have dropped. But from 2021, we're definitely going to have more supply available. So the question is going to be, can we find homes for it without China? And when you look at China, this is pretty stark. So this chart shows you in orange our exports to China by value in the 4 quarters of the 1920 financial year. And then in green, the equivalent figures for this financial year. So this is April to June. At the end, quarter 4 is April to June 2021. And it's dramatic. We're down to 13 million compared with 419 million. So that is a very big hit. There is no denying it. And then the other point to throw into the mix is that wine grape average value has always tracked export price closely as well. And it's a bit difficult to know which is the chicken and which is the egg, I suppose. But if export values go down, wine grape prices are also likely to go down. So if we are short of markets, shall we say, or long on supply, then export prices are likely to come down, and that could have a corresponding effect on grape prices. And this is just a quote I picked up from Tony Battaline in their update on Tuesday. And I thought this was pretty true. There are a lot of unknowns, and I am very positive about a lot of the things that we can still do and the market opportunities. And as I said to you, all that context, it's not oversupply by itself. It's very good quality. There are market opportunities out there. But what we do know is that in the short term, it is going to be difficult to place all of this 2021 vintage, especially the reds, at a similar price to what was offered by China. Looking ahead then, the size of the 2021 vintage and the loss of the China market is likely to have an impact on wine grape prices next vintage, and this is particularly the case for reds. Those of you who follow the bulk wine market or the CATI prices, you'll see that already there are big drops in Australian red prices on the global market. How much of that is just driven by sentiment? In other words, we've heard what happened to you in China, you have to take a lower price. I don't know. The tricky part though is that if growers expect prices to drop, there is an incentive to increase cropping levels to make up in yield per hectare for a loss in dollars per tonne. That will exacerbate issues in placing wine at a sustainable price. It will also exacerbate capacity issues and freight transfer issues, which are causing problems at the moment. So we really do not need a large crop in 2022 to the extent that we can control it. And it's really important that growers work with winemakers to ensure the best outcome from next vintage, because lots of cheap fruit on the market being bought up cheap and sold really cheap will really not help. So on that rather sobering note, I'm afraid, I strongly encourage you to check out our interactive insights portal. You will find not only the crush data, but also the up-to-date export data. And if you are someone listening who is looking for markets, you'll find that there's also a market explorer, which has really good information on markets you might be looking at, not just our exports, but also what their total consumption is, what the price profile of their total consumption is, how much of it's on-premise, off-premise, red, white, etc. And that's all really good information. And the other thing I encourage you to do, you'll see this button, Ask an Analyst, on the website. It's on the Interactive Insights portal page. Please book now. It's it's our job to help you. It's not a nuisance. We encourage you to book a session with us. It could be training in how to use the dashboards. It could be, where do I find insights on other markets? Or it could be, I've got this product I'm trying to place, or I'm trying to negotiate with a winemaker. What do I need to know? What can you tell me? And, we'd love to work with you. When I say we, there's Peter Bailey, Angelica Crabb and myself in the Insights team. And that's about me done, Jeff.
Thanks, Sandy. There's a few more comments that have come through. People are really happy, I suppose, with the dashboard in terms of being able to customize it to, obviously, if you're in a particular region or looking at, the different vintages, what's happening on a longer trend, I suppose. So that's a few comments, all very similar around that. But no actually other questions that have come through yet. So if you do have a question, just please type that through now. There's a lot of, I would have imagined there's a lot of questions that would come from your presentation. There's a lot of things that have happened this year, what's going to happen next year, the volume produced, export, and the challenges in some of the other countries as well.
Why don't I do, just seeing we're doing quite well for time, if you don't mind, I'll spend 5 more minutes on the dashboard so I can actually show people some of the ways that they can drive the dashboard. So if anyone obviously doesn't want to see that, they can drop off. But meanwhile, if they've got questions, they can come through. And it may be that the dashboards I can use the question to demonstrate something in the dashboard.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, it's a good way to demonstrate, I suppose.
Okay. All right, so I'm back in the dashboard, and this is something, so I didn't want to take time in case I ran out of time, but the overview page is the difference between this page and every other page is that this uses estimated tonnes, and you'll see it says that there, which means that Wine Australia has raised the number that we've actually collected from wineries to be what we think the total crush is, because obviously we don't have a response from every single person. So in 2021, I physically collected and processed 1.8 million tonnes. And from that, based on an estimated non-response rate, that's what we think the crush was in an estimated way. And so on this screen, you're looking at the estimated crush, and we do that by variety. So if you did want to look at just Shiraz, or let's go with Cabernet because it's here, you can see here when you choose a variety, you can use the search bar to type something in. Because they're square boxes, it means you can actually choose multiple. So if for some reason you wanted Shiraz and you wanted to add it to Ruby Cabernet, if I hold down Control, I can select both of them at once, and then that will give me the crush and the value, and then also the historical details and how it's broken up between own grown and purchased. So you can, that's how you do those things. If you're sick of that, this little eraser here will rub out your previous selection. You'll go back to all, or if you want to rub out all of your selections at once, you can just choose reset filters. So that's that first page. All the other pages use actual collected tonnes. So this is where those of you who are missing the PDF and saying, well, you know, I want the region intake table for my region, you can get it from here, because why don't I stick with Margaret River? This is it here for 2021, and I can actually print it. If I choose print, and then the preview comes up, and instead of printing it, I might choose save as a PDF, and then there's your region intake table. So that's a good thing to do. And you can also actually download all the data. So if you came in here and you see these white boxes pop up, go to the 3 dots and choose export data. And I'm not actually going to do it because it's going to jump to an Excel screen, but trust me, if you do that, in fact, if we go to the next stage where you choose summarize data and then you say, press the yellow box, then it will download your data into Excel.
Sandy, we've got a question just saying, are there any plans to include the hectares by variety in the dashboard?
Okay, so behind this dashboard, there's a data set in a data warehouse, but we do actually have a data set of the plantings by variety. But the trouble is, as I said to you, it only goes back to 2015. So I guess we could probably do it. We could probably build a dashboard using that data. So it's something I'll take on board. But the trouble is, we really have to question the value. What we're actually working on at the moment is a project to try and almost calculate the area by variety based on the crush. And because we know the total area by region, we think that if we can sort of just work out shares and then work out a sort of factor for the fact that some varieties have higher yields than others, we can do an estimate of the area by variety. But you have to look at the, again, I'd be really interested in the feedback. What does that tell people that's better than just knowing what the crush is? Like, why do they need the area?
It might be some of the other questions coming through are like linking it back to the type of wine that the intake went to produce. So, for example, for Chardonnay, the percent of Chardonnay that went for table wine versus sparkling wine. And there's some other questions as well on breaking it down by clone as well, which
okay, and I bet you that's someone who doesn't actually answer the survey themselves. But yeah, so what we're using is Weybridge summary reports. I think it would be almost impossible to get that data at the level of a clone. Tasmania do have an extra question, which is, is the Chardonnay used for sparkling or still? It's theoretically possible for us to add that in, and same for Pinot Noir, or anything really, but probably those two would be the main ones. But it would depend. If you picture a really big winery like Treasury and all their intake batches, like they give us maybe 20,000 lines of data. The question is, do they actually record it as sparkling or still in the first place? Because if they don't at that point, it would be impossible for them to sort of, manually add it in. So it's more difficult than you might think, but I agree it would be of value, especially because if you think about prices, that, the price paid for a still Chardonnay compared with a sparkling, or a still Pinot compared with a sparkling, especially in particular regions, they really might be quite different. Other than that, all you can really do is, I suppose, single out the regions, like maybe the Adelaide Hills, where you're reasonably sure that the Chardonnay is being used for sparkling, and Tasmania. Something else you can do here, just to show you, so I've pulled up Chardonnay, and this is where you can look at everything. So you might go, who crushed the most Chardonnay? So I've clicked on the heading for total crushed, so I can sort them. Well, no surprises there. But, coming down the list, Pathway, Adelaide Hills, you might be interested. You're from Heathcote. This tells you where you fit. The other thing you can do is sort by average value. So again, you might see, well, okay, so the Mornington Peninsula was the region that paid the highest for Chardonnay. On the other hand, there were only 226 tonnes purchased, so it's a fairly small sample. Whereas, maybe getting down to Adelaide Hills and Yarra Valley, there's a bigger sample. Got anything else, Jeff?
Yeah, a few more comments. Just congratulating the Wine Australia team. It's one of the best industry-wide tools that's been developed for a while. That's good.
Thank you very much.
I'll share these comments with you, and if there's any feedback that helps with further development. So that looks like that one. People have asked for a link to the page or the dashboard, so we can provide that with the webinar recording link.
Yeah, and sorry, yeah, definitely do that, because you'll be emailing everyone, so then they've got a link they can click on. But I did put a link in the slide, but then who's going to sit there and type it? I tried Googling interactive insights and it didn't work. But maybe if you could Google Wine Australia dashboard, I reckon that would work. Or just go to our homepage, and as I said to you, from the homepage, market insights, interactive insights, and then bookmark it, and you're good from then on.
Okay, so yeah, we'll forward you those questions as well. I haven't got any more that have come through. Just hang on, if anyone is typing, just type it now. Otherwise, I'm sure you can contact Sandy after the webinar as well. Actually,
yeah, that's a good point, Jeff. So yeah, again, please bear in mind that our Market Insights team is funded by the R&D levy. Much like probably the AWRI help desk, we exist to help you. You're not a nuisance if you're asking us a question. So you can email us at market.insights@wineaustralia.com. And, we're really pleased to hear from particularly our levy payers, but, also students, journalists, consultants, all sorts of people ask us questions.
No worries. 3 more questions, but they're all thanks. Thanks, Sandy. Okay, so as we just talked about, any more questions you think of after this session, yeah, please contact Sandy or the Market Insights team as well. And thanks, I suppose, Sandy, to you for coming in today to present this session. I think everyone got quite a bit out of it with that many questions and comments. Also thank the audience for joining in today, particularly over the current circumstances and times with the different states and lockdowns. As always, once this session's finished, we'll send you an email with the webinar recording. And that will send you to the presentation on the YouTube channel. I'd like to acknowledge Wine Australia as well for providing the funding and the support for this platform for the webinars through the Edinburgh Extension Program. The next webinar is in a couple of weeks' time on the 29th of July. We're going to have Dr. Mark Sosnowski from Sardi and Mia Fisher from Simone and Search discussing winter pruning to increase the longevity of vines. If you want to register for this session, visit the AWRI website on the webinar section and register. Thanks, Sandy, again. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Stay safe, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next AWRI webinar.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
See ya.